The authoritarian personality is a dispositional explanation in contrast with situational explanations for obedience. Now, bear in mind that when this was a question in the past, the big problem was that people didn't present this as an explanation for obedience, but just described the F scale and the traits of authoritarian personality without linking it explicitly with why people with authoritarian personality are more likely to obey. So make sure that when you're presenting your points, you always emphasize that link back to explanation for obedience. So as we said, this is a dispositional explanation that means that we attribute obedience not to something to do with the circumstances, but something to do with the personality of the individual, meaning that some people are just more likely to obey an authority figure because of their personality traits. Adorno came up with the F scale. His interest was to explain why so many people just willingly obeyed orders, and he said that there was a personality type that is more likely to obey an authority figure. Individuals with certain traits, and these are important to know about. You might be asked simply to outline one or two traits of an authoritarian personality. So you want to talk about, yes, high levels of obedience to authority, but also rigidity of thinking, intolerance, prejudice. Those are all things that he considered problematic from a mental health perspective. So he brings in, as we'll see, a psychodynamic explanation for why those personality traits might be developed. Remember that Freud talks about the three parts of personality, the tripartite system, and therefore our personality forms as a result of our early childhood experiences. He devised the F scale with using a large sample, and he was assessing their unconscious attitudes towards others, specifically their prejudice against minority racial groups. The F scale looks at the beliefs in totalitarian state rule, a supreme leader, so those ideas that are obviously linked to fascism, Nazism, but in the commentary we'll see that it's not only extreme right-wing thinking that can result in this totalitarian regime, and that was overlooked by Adorno. He found that those who had higher scores on this F scale, they felt that they were strong, and they were contemptuous of anyone seen as weak. So obviously valuing status is part of that kind of thinking pattern of thinking hierarchically about the value of people. The cognitive style, as I said, they had no grey areas. It was very black and white thinking, rigidity of thinking, and an inability to see nuances. They were likely to have stereotypical beliefs, and those stereotypes were fixed, as you can see, and a positive correlation between authoritarianism and prejudice. So that's your description of authoritarian personality. What you want to look at is the associated behavior, and this is where you link the traits with the likelihood of obeying, and therefore making this an explanation for obedience. Because they've got rigid beliefs, they've got traditional ideas, they don't like change, they don't like disorder, and having a hierarchy is a form of societal order, and therefore they're very much going to buy into that idea of legitimacy of authority and not question it. They have hostility against other groups, and therefore they're likely to obey any orders that require them to maybe hurt or harm people in a weaker position. They don't like ambiguity, they like clarity, so they can see things as right or wrong. So if there's a political narrative that says that certain people are less valuable and disposable, they'll be easily buying into that, and therefore obey the people in charge, the people with power, to just kind of carry on that agenda. And they're submissive towards authority figures, and that obviously means that they will not question the authority figure, and they're more likely to experience an agentic shift. Now, according to Adorno, as I mentioned, this personality comes from a mixed set of emotions that developed as a result of harsh and punitive upbringing. Not a lot of love, a lot of punishment, a lot of harsh upbringing. So the fear of parents is developed because obviously the fear of punishment, alongside that hatred of the parents because they didn't give the love, affection and security that the person needed. In terms of the outcome, that means on one hand, the fear of the parents internalizes that fear of anyone with higher authority or higher status, as the parents are for the child, and therefore excessive respect of authority figures. But at the same time, this bottled up unconscious anger that they're going to displace. Remember, displacement is this defense mechanism where you move your feelings towards one object or person to another. So obviously minority groups and people with no power are easy targets for displacing that frustration. So here's a summary. Very disciplined upbringing that leads to unconscious hostility, displacement towards minority groups, and therefore prejudice, because it's easy to hurt people if you develop cognitively an idea that they're not worthy or they deserve to be punished in some way. So now moving on to the AO3, don't forget, if you get stuck in the exam and you forget a point to make, go through ELISA, think, do I remember any evidence? No. Is there a better explanation, so you can compare it to a more appropriate explanation? For example, we'll see that Nazi Germany is a phenomenon that can't really explain by everybody having the same personality pattern. Are there any issues and debates? Nature, nurture, free will, determinism. What are the implications of saying that obedience is a result of personality traits that might be seen as fixed? Is the evidence that we have scientific? And also, can we use these findings in the real world? So first of all, the evidence we have is the follow-up study by Elms and Milgram looking at participants who were high in their level of obedience. And what we find is that participants who obeyed, first thing that is confirmed is that they were much more likely to go the whole 450 volt. There was a strong positive correlation between how highly they scored on the F scale and how highly they administered the shocks to the learner up to 450 volts. The second finding is also that the people who obeyed more reported being less close to their fathers during childhood and showed bigger admiration for the experimenter, proving that there is a kind of continuum, there is a link between these personality traits and early childhood experiences. Now we have to consider the fact that Milgram and Elms' research is correlational. So remember, correlation does not mean causation. The fact that there was a link between these personality traits and obedience doesn't mean that the obedience was directly caused by that authoritarian personality set of traits. It might be that there's a third variable that is not relevant or not connected directly to their research that has influenced both of these. It could be situational factors, it could be socio-political factors, it could be cultural factors. And that means that we can't trust the validity of this research because extraneous variables have not been controlled for. Now, as I mentioned before, it seems highly unlikely that every person that joined the kind of Nazi narrative had the same personality. So social identity theory seems to be a more appropriate explanation, where people identified as German people with those anti-Semitic beliefs because it was built in a way where the Jews were seen as an out-group, and therefore they identified with their own in-group, therefore seeing the Jewish people as an out-group, and therefore immediately creating conflict between the two groups, rather than explaining it as a widespread personality pattern in a certain moment in time in history. And again, this means that there are more appropriate and more accurate explanations for obedience, for example, social identity theory, compared to authoritarian personality. So remember, you're always linking it back to whether it's a good or not explanation for obedience. We also have problems with the F scale, especially using it today. It would be very outdated. It's got lots of questions that don't apply anymore based on very, very old-fashioned traditional values. Also, the traits that are most relevant to authoritarian personality are right-wing, and that leads us to the next point, that is political bias. Left-wing authoritarianism is a reality, and you can give examples. For example, Russian Bolshevism and Chinese Maoism, both are very totalitarian, very politically encouraging blind obedience to an authority figure. So Adorno really misses out by being politically biased on right-wing extremism, on giving an idea of how the full spectrum, meaning that people that might have left-wing authoritarian traits are missed out when using the F scale, therefore again challenging the validity of the F scale, and as a consequence the authoritarian personality as a comprehensive explanation for obedience. There is also specific confounding variables that have been identified associated with the authoritarian personality. For example, one piece of research, you don't need to remember the name, but here it is, found that less educated people are more likely to display authoritarian personality. So again, when we're talking about the issues with correlational evidence, we could argue that it might be just ignorance, lack of education, lack of knowledge, lack of understanding the whole history of events that might make people more susceptible to just accepting messages from people of high status without challenging them. And if we think about it, this is still very relevant today to the kind of political landscape.